All right, everyone, thank you for being here. So I'd like to introduce Dekendra Dazzell, who is a graduate student of SUNY Fredonia. She has a bachelor's degree in sociology, and she is a Black Guyanese woman whose interests include Black liberation and the holistic upliftment of the Black community. Dekendra works intentionally and diligently to create safe spaces that illuminate Black voices and celebrate Black culture. During COVID-19, she has collaborated with other community leaders to create nourishing and empowering workshops and hold forums for Black women to share and discuss their lived experiences, which include body policing, colorism, silencing, emotional labor, oppression, joy, and liberation. During this time, she has also provided assistance with editing and is presently an avid qualitative researcher exploring Black people's perception of race based hierarchies within the US and the mental health effects COVID-19 has on Black and Latino healthcare workers. Dekendra also recently started a tea business called Ancestral Teas and Tings, and it's an LLC where she is the project manager. In the future, Dekendra looks forward to furthering her vision of Black self determination and critical consciousness by working with organizations that promote empowerment and socio emotional learning within the Black community.
My name is Dekendra Dazzell, and today I will be presenting on the myths of the revolution, tokenization, and periodization. Okay, so let's jump right in. Also, I just want everyone to know that I will be asking questions throughout my presentation, so just brace yourself for that. Okay, so some key points we'll be touching upon today is understanding periodization, understanding tokenization, the dangers of periodization and tokenization as they intersect, and reframing our understanding of the revolution. So to start off, what is periodization? Periodization is classified as a process or study of categorizing the past into discrete, quantified name blocks of time in order to facilitate the study and analysis of history. So essentially, periodization is where researchers or historians will collect data and quantify them into time periods. Sounds like, okay, yeah, that makes sense in order to put it into history. However, the problems of periodization are often that Black voices and Black history gets lost within this. So within the US context, periodization has been used to summarize the Black history in some of these years. So in 1862, Lincoln passes the Emancipation Proclamation. In 1865, the 13th Amendment is passed. In 1868, the 14th Amendment. In 1954, the Civil Rights era begins. In 1954 as well, Brown versus Board of Education occurs. 1964, the Civil Rights Act. 1965, the Voting Rights Act. And 1968, Civil Rights era ends. So as you see, all of Black history is not put into this timeline. However, there are these clear, neat markers of when Black revolution, Black thought, and Black freedom started and ended. Problems with this is that laws are not what makes struggles or revolutions real. When you start with Lincoln passing the Emancipation Proclamation as a pivotal point, or even the 13th Amendment as a pivotal point of Black people gaining their freedom, you then negate all the individuals that were a part of that struggle. And you also negate the fact that these moments did not occur in a vacuum. Black people have been fighting for their freedom since they were enslaved or captured from their home continent of Africa. There's also not a magic era, which typically people see and hear these movements or these time periods and think that you had to be in the right place and right time for this change to enact. And they don't realize that the very real steps that occurred before the 14th Amendment, 13th Amendment, and all of these different pivotal points that people may pinpoint in Black history. It also creates an illusion that these movements happened such a long time ago. You hear 1862 and you're like, oh, wow, so slavery was done with like a while ago. Or here, the civil rights era began and it ended in 1968, and it kind of makes you think, oh, well, I guess Black people are fine because there wasn't another civil rights movement or civil rights era. So debunking periodization looks like adequately representing the timeline of the Black movement and the Black struggle and the Black fight for liberation. The first thing I want to touch upon is that rebellions have been happening. Like I said it before. In 1791, there was the St. John insurrection, one rebellion, 1831, another rebellion, Nat Turner rebellion. These were really Black people fighting against slavery. And these were really the starting points of why Black people gained their freedom, in a sense, right? I use that term loosely, freedom. Rebellions against enslavement happened years earlier than the Emancipation Proclamation. And oftentimes people look to Abraham Lincoln as he's the person that's freed enslaved peoples, right? When he is actually noted clearly as saying, if I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. He's more looking at this from a presidential standpoint of a white benefiting standpoint, and not about I care about Black people and I want them to be liberated. That's not the case. Then just to go through these other time periods, in 1865, it says that 13th Amendment that's supposed to end slavery, right? However, we still have modern day slavery happening in 2020. We have prisons, and we also have plantations, basically, where immigrants typically work and they are paid low wages. They're not given respect. And typically for immigrants, because they are immigrants, they cannot advocate for themselves out of fear that they may be deported or whatever the case is. They often live in very harsh living conditions. Same goes for prisons. They're paid 5 cents and oftentimes less than that for the labor that they do that does fuel corporations in US capitalism. Yet that is ignored, and we don't see that as modern day slavery. So when you ask, slavery ended in 1865. Did it really, when we look at the trends in 2020? Also, we have in 1868, it says the 14th Amendment was passed, granting citizenship to folks. Yet there's several loopholes around that, to where you can lose your citizenship, right, if you go to prison, or you can lose your citizenship if you are not a citizen of the country, even though that you contribute to the society. There's a lot of different loopholes throughout this. And then we also have the civil rights era begins in 1954, having this clear marker of when Black people started to rise up, essentially, and decide that they wanted to work against the injustices. However, this has been happening. This is not just something that started in 1954. And in 1964, the Civil Rights Act was supposed to outlaw discrimination based on race, yet you still see discrimination discrepancies. They are often discriminated against because of their hair type. There's been several studies done where two people, Black and white, will walk into a place with the same resume, and they're discriminated against in that way, where they don't get the job but the white person will. So these are just further examples of how, although we have this nice periodized timeline of when Black people began to fight for their rights, it doesn't reflect today's society. And just to touch upon one more, Brown versus Board of Ed in 1954, it was supposed to outlaw segregation in schools. Yet in 2020, schools are the most segregated than they've ever been. So now when we look at tokenization, first I want to start off with the definition of token as defined by Merriam-Webster. So a token is a small part representing the whole, a member of a group, something given or shown as a guarantee, as of authority, right, or identity. So for the purpose of today's lecture, I combine these two terms, and I will be using the term idealizing. Tokenization is idealizing and highlighting select leaders and moments in the history of Black struggle and resistance. So what does tokenization typically look like? It looks like a few leaders being highlighted within movements to essentially commemorate them and look to them for an understanding of Blackness and understanding of the Black revolution and fight for Black liberation. So now here comes the question part. I'm going to ask you all a few questions. So who is typically highlighted during times of slavery? Some people I also highlighted that are typically talked about is Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass. You may hear about Nat Turner. To answer the next question, what are they known for? We view people in a very passive light, as if it wasn't very intentional, as if enslaved peoples, they didn't use their hair, like braided maps into their hair. They didn't utilize the stars, and they didn't actively go back and try to free their family, their lineage, the people that were also enslaved with them. Typically, leaders will be tokenized in certain lights of, okay, you know, you are the poor slave who just so happened to get free, or your master just so happened to teach you how to read, or you know, or like you didn't try at all to become free. And that's typically how we hear about Black people, and they're painted in this very docile light as if they accepted slavery, when in reality that wasn't the case. They actively fought against this, and they actually fought to be free, and in many times they did achieve that goal. But that's often taken out of history. So we can do the same thing with the civil rights era. Who's typically highlighted during the civil rights era? This one might be a bit easier because there's like a few names that just jump out. How are they typically classified in history? Like, how do people describe them?
Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, the Little Rock Nine, the people who sat at I think it was the Greensboro sit-in, and just like a lot of prominent civil rights like pushbacks, like rebellions, I guess.
Wow, I thought you were like looking at I thought I wrote in like my information on the sides. I was like, yeah, you named a lot of people that I also thought of immediately when I heard this as well. And
they were known as like rebellious and people who like tried to step out of their place, quote. But they're mostly known like prominent figures because they were the ones, I guess, that were chosen to show that Black people were trying to push back and gain equality.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I really like the words that you used when you described that. You stated that they were the ones that were chosen, and they're typically painted in these lights, and they are the civil rights leaders that are highlighted, which is exactly the case, which brings me to the problems of tokenization. So typically what happens is we get a regurgitated idea in history of who our civil rights leaders were, or who our Black history leaders were. And it's often a whitewashed history where, you know, the idea of Martin Luther King, you know, he's the peaceful protester and believed in civil disobedience. We have Malcolm X, he hates hatred for white people. He's divisive, he's the Black Muslim, he's the extremist. And we see Rosa Parks, and she's, you know, just a really tired older woman that just couldn't get up. Like, she just couldn't do it today. And she sat down because of that. And even with the Little Rock Nine, you hear about their bravery, and you see the photos of them, you know, walking into school, even though there's several white mobs screaming at them. And they're just so proud to integrate into school. However, what that does is it gives us a limited understanding of the revolution and what really happened. We create a narrative of people's lives, the rebel, the saint, the young and the old, and we ignore the nuances in people and try to fit them into a misleading role. So, for example, we see Rosa Parks as this very docile person, right, who just couldn't get up. In reality, she was trained into that role. In fact, Claudette Coleman, I'm sure Professor Dazzell is probably going to tell you all about this or has already, was supposed to play that role that she did on the bus where she sat in and said no and refused to get up. However, because Claudette Coleman was a dark-skinned woman and teen mother at the time, or becoming a teen mother at the time, she couldn't play that role. So that role was extremely intentional. And Rosa Parks was actually very much so active in the civil rights movement or active in fighting for justice for Black lives. However, that's not how she's painted. It's just coincidental. And typically what that does is it erases the narratives of all these people in history and then makes Black people to come feel as if that they cannot do what these civil rights leaders did, right? Because, oh, it was just because of the time. It was just this random moment that cannot be replaced or it cannot occur again. When in fact, people have been trained in this. People have ways in which they know how to do this. There's systems that go about starting a revolution and continuing a revolution. And there's documentation of this. However, it's hidden in these very big idealized stories of this one time that something happened. So yeah, that erasure piece is really big because for several different key actors, like the dark skin, the fat, the queer, the non-binary people that are often silenced in these roles, they're not seen as an integral part of Black movements, despite their contributions to Black movements. So here we have debunking tokenization, and these are some of the many hidden figures a part of like Black revolution and Black rebellion. We don't hear about, you know, Queen Annie, who was an integral part in rebelling in Jamaica. We don't hear about Shirley Chisholm, who ran for presidency, and she was also a part of Congress. We don't hear about Nannie Helen, a businesswoman and also an educator. These people are not pinpointed, although they were next to, they were behind, they were in close proximity with all these leaders that we do hear about. But the silencing serves to regurgitate a message that the Black movement and the Black movement to freedom was very much so in a time frame, and it happened and now it's done. And also that only certain people that look a certain way can then achieve the same type of result. So I talked about periodization alone, and I also talked about tokenization alone. But when they're mixed together, it creates another nuanced problem for Black people. So I'm going to read an excerpt from Jean Theo Harris's book, The Rebellious Life of Miss Rosa Parks, where she kind of touches upon how these two connect. So it says, having a casket on view in the Capitol honored Parks as a national dignitary while reminding mourners that their experiences were sponsored by the federal government. Look how far the nation has come. The events tactically announced. Look at what a great nation we are. A woman who had been denied a seat at the bus 50 years earlier was now lying in the Capitol. Instead of using the opportunity to illuminate and address the current social inequality, the public spectacle provided an opportunity for the nation to lay to rest a national heroine and its own history of racism. Having her casket on view in the Capitol honored Parks as a national dignitary while reminding mourners that their experience was sponsored by the federal government. Look how far the nation has come, the events tactically announced. Look at what a great nation we are. A woman who had been denied a seat at the bus 50 years earlier was now laying in the Capitol. Instead of using the opportunity to illuminate and address current social inequality, the public spectacle provided an opportunity for the nation to lay to rest a national heroine in its own history of racism.
It makes it sound like racism is solved when it's not.
Yes, exactly. That's a great answer. And it actually brings to my 2 points on the slide, which is what I call the wrapping up effect, where leaders in the United States, they use these pivotal moments or these moments to honor a Black person or someone a part of the civil rights movement or any movement to say, hey, look, we honored you. So therefore, we're wrapping up this time period. You know, racism isn't a thing anymore because we gave you all this big ceremony. Malcolm X is on a stamp. We have so much memorabilia of Martin Luther King. Bill Clinton is writing, giving medals to the Little Rock Nine. And, you know, there was talk about Harriet Tubman being on the $20 bill as if this absolves the injustice that the US is still performing and all the racism and prejudice and discrimination that Black people are still currently going through. They use these performative progress acts in order to showcase like, hey, you know, we're not as bad as it seems. You know, we've done this great, amazing thing. Everyone's clapping. And typically you'll hear in maybe an inaugural speech or in any of these elected official speeches, them saying something about the amount of progress we've made and how all of this was such a long time ago and we're stepping into 2020. However, we still see it rampant today. And I'll read another excerpt from the book, which actually is interesting. So Rosa Parks passed away in 2005. And so in 2013, they actually unraveled the statue of her. And let me just read this excerpt real quick. Rosa Parks was given the remarkable tribute, but many of the public statements framed her action in ways odds to the context of her bus stand and lifelong political commitments. And this incredible distinction was bestowed on a day when the Supreme Court was taking yet another step to unravel one of the accomplishments that Parks and her comrades had struggled for decades to achieve. A memorial statue was deemed more relevant to the present day than enforced voting rights protection. So essentially what that passage is addressing is the fact that they're unraveling the statue the same day that a Supreme Court hearing is going on that's essentially voter suppressing Black people. So you have this performative activism and performative progress of, because we tokenize these leaders, and once they're dead, we can wrap up this era. You know, once they pass away, that means that the movement is over. It's also probably not a coincidence that the same year Martin Luther King passed away is the same year that the civil rights era just ended. Even though you have the Black Panther Party arising, you have people, different sanctions from these movements, you know, really radicalizing and really realizing, you know, it's time to act and continuing to act. And even today, you still have people acting, yet those voices are silenced because media doesn't center them anymore. Media isn't centering or covering them anymore, or their thought. So it's just interesting to see this. So now tokenization and periodization today. Can anyone tell me why these assortments of photos would suggest tokenization and periodization today? Is there a specific photo that shows performative activism? Or all of them, do you think, show performative activism? Thoughts? In regards to this performative kneeling, as if it signifies, you know, I stand in solidarity. Mind you, when a Black man did it, it was looked at, his career was destroyed because of that, right? But now it's, you have the police doing it, it's supposed to symbolize something. There has been several accounts where they kneel and then right after they'll tear gas the entire crowd of people protesting. And mind you, this isn't even rioting, this is protesting, and they're tear gassing the entire crowd. Black Lives Matter has turned into the I voted Obama for 2020, it seems like, where individuals, they'll put Black Lives Matter on their windowsill, or if you look to the bottom left, it says, please don't damage this property, BLM, 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 as if that's like, a code word for, hey, don't attack me because I support Black Lives Matter, as if now all you have to do is say something, say these token words, these token images, or do these token gestures of kneeling, and you get a pass. As if racism didn't exist anymore, there wouldn't be riots, there wouldn't be people in the streets, there wouldn't be senseless killing of Black lives. And then also what you see is, especially on social media, if you all are on social media, people kind of almost making a game out of Breonna Taylor's death, where, also trigger warning, I'm sorry, I should have said that earlier. And they are essentially making posts saying, oh, today's a great day to arrest the cops that blah, blah, for Breonna Taylor, or whatever the case is. And it's like, yes, that may be getting on a message. However, is it really doing anything? We have to ask about the change that occurs after these protests, after the marches, after the big murals, after the several Black Lives Matter stands. Like, what happens then? Is that the only act that we are doing and calling it a revolution? You know what I mean? So I'll go back really quick to this slide, where you see also in today's protest, what you'll see is these signs of, we are not our ancestors, we will F you up, or you mess with the wrong generation. That just goes back to the limited understanding of the revolution and the erasure of the Black people, our Black ancestors within our revolution, because they did in fact fight. They were in fact revolutionaries. They did in fact lay their literal lives down for what they believed in. And it's now that we're transforming into, oh, because I protested and yelled at something, then I can make this sign that says, I will mess you up. And it's like, you don't know half of what your ancestors did. So it's just a clear sign of erasure, even today. So going back to this last slide, yeah, like all of you have said, it's clear that we can make noise, right? We can walk outside and we can do all of this, and that lasts a day. It makes you feel good. It builds camaraderie with individuals of like, yeah, I wrote a sign, I was really upset, and I walked out. However, in the end, what change is being made? In Manhattan, they got their Black Lives Matter painted mural right on the floor. And when you walk down the street a few blocks, there were a bunch of protesters still asking the mayor to do something and make reform in regards to all the shootings happening. So when you really look at it, someone will smile and take a photo and say, look at the progress we've made by saying Black Lives Matter. And then there's still people dying every day, still Black people senselessly dying every day. And either those messages are not being showed in the media, or they're being taken over by these positive messages of, but look, we did this cute thing, right? That will last, what, a day? So how do we dissolve tokenization and periodization? First, it starts with understanding symbols of change, that symbols of change are not the same as true structural change. What does that mean? If you are in a position of power, if you are a white person, instead of making a symbol, a post about something, have those conversations, those difficult conversations with your family members who may hold those ideologies and think that Black people are harmful. Change the way you think, educate yourself on your own, and don't rely on your Black peers, partners, friends, or anything to give you a pass. For Black people, it's educating yourself on your ancestors, on the people that came before you, on their very real struggle and change, and the different ways in which they made those changes. also realizing that kneeling, material goods, or praise is simply not enough. We have been stripped of so much as Black people. Our communities have been bombed, we have been enslaved, we are still, Flint still doesn't have clean water. There's so many problems that are still going on in our communities, yet we see a symbol, we see someone kneeling when they present a bill that may not change anything, and they say, okay, yeah, that's a good enough sign, they're trying. It's time to get, discontent with just trying. The revolution will not be televised. It starts with educating yourself and removing harm. What does that mean? Don't look for a large protest, or don't look for the media to cover change. Because realistically, that small change that happens every single day when you educate yourself, or that small change that happens when you no longer believe in something, so you no longer support a system, that is effective change. And it also is a way of debunking periodization of like, oh yeah, you need this one big moment, this one big time period to represent change, when in fact it's continuous. In addition to that, it also changes the narrative of you need this one person, right, to act. You are a big enough actor to educate yourself and those around you and make change in that way. And as a reminder, it is my personal belief that a revolution is not tied to a body, person, or time. Rather, it is a belief that survives the change of time and is true and truly liberates the minds of people it enters. What does that mean? That means that the revolution is not based on a person, a face, a thing, or a time period. The revolution starts when harm is no longer occurring consistently for people. The revolution begins when you start to realize that just seeing a token of appreciation or gratitude is not enough, especially when it's not backed up. Black people should not have to code switch in white society to fit in. We should have our own space to speak how we want to. I should be able to speak slang in this lecture right now and it shouldn't be a problem. There are several ways in which we begin a revolution, and it does not always mean that it is the biggest way. So with that, thank you.